Hello, PF warriors from all around the world, and thank you so much for joining this special medical meeting sponsored by Vicor Pharma, where they are unlocking a potential of a new class of drugs in rare lung diseases and beyond, including ALMI, their digital therapy for treating anxiety in pulmonary fibrosis patients. My name is Shelley Mathis, Executive Director of Educational Programming for the PF Warriors, and I'm here today with my husband, who has RA-ILD, and he's doing very well, I think. Say hi, Scott. We also have Jessica Schull, Director of Digital Therapeutics at Vicor, who we will hear from a little bit later. Wave your hand, Jessica. And our distinguished guest is Dr. Robert Hallowell. I have only worked about a week with Dr. Hallowell. I've found him to be very smart, very clever, very gracious. So if he's your doctor, you're very lucky. Dr. Hallowell is Director, Interstitial Lung Disease, ILD Program, Director, Pulmonary Ambulatory Practice, and Assistant Professor of Medicine for the Pulmonary and Critical Care Fellowship Program at the Massachusetts General Hospital. His academic interests include ILD, sarcoidosis, and connective tissue disease associated with lung disease. He is a Harvard Pulmonary and Critical Care Fellowship Teacher of the Year. Dr. Hallowell's research focuses on determining the significance of autoantibodies in the phenotype and outcome of interstitial lung disease. He also focuses on developing the most effective treatment strategies for patients with connective tissue disease associated with ILD. Dr. Hallowell will talk to us about hypoxia and anxiety. He has a tight schedule this afternoon, so I get to start asking some questions, but he will also be very interested in hearing from you all as long as you don't ask for medical advice about your particular situation. So, Dr. Hallowell, welcome to the PF Warriors. We are thrilled to have you join us today. And can you tell us a little bit about your work and your research?
Well, thank you very much for that incredibly gracious welcome. I don't know that any of that is deserved. It's just wonderful to be part of your community. I know this is a community, and I appreciate you welcoming me into your safe space here. It truly is an honor and a privilege. My research focuses, it's mostly clinical research. I focus on primarily connective tissue diseases, so patients who have rheumatoid arthritis, myositis, scleroderma, et cetera, trying to identify clinical patterns, autoantibody patterns to define patients who get worse, who get better with various treatment patterns. And so that's why we've developed large databases to try to figure out how we can make patients better and more effective treatments. I've also been involved in several clinical trials and will continue to do so. I do give a lot of lectures. I do speak to various patient groups around the country. I think what makes today a little bit unique, and I think it's important to have transparency and to be transparent about our conflicts of interest, is that I am also a PI on the Vicor study that Jessica is going to talk about later. And so I think it's always important that we're aware of that. When I'm speaking today, that I am one of the study investigators here with Vicor. So with that, I'm happy to discuss this topic and take questions that you may have about this. And I may not have the answer. If I don't, I will be upfront about that. But I'm happy to share my experience and to hopefully explain things in a way that you can understand and get some meaningful education about that.
Okay, great. Well, let's get going on some questions I've already collected. First, what is hypoxia, or should we really be using the term hypoxemia? What is it, and what's the difference between those two terms?
Yeah, the terms are used interchangeably, but I think the purpose of our lungs, the reason we have lungs, is to help with gas exchange. And our lungs are remarkable organs. I think they're the most fascinating organ in the body. I'm a little biased. But inside your lungs, you have, on average, give or take, 400 million alveoli or air sacs. 400 million. And the reason we have so many is to increase the surface area or the amount of space available to help our bodies absorb oxygen from the air and get rid of the carbon dioxide we produce as a metabolic byproduct. And so if you were to take each of those 400 million air sacs and open them up and lay them flat, kind of the way if you unravel a chocolate Easter egg or a chocolate Hershey Kiss, if you were to unravel the foil of each of those 400 million air sacs and lay them flat on the ground, they would cover the surface of a tennis court. And so that's remarkable, right? And so that's why we have lungs, so that we can absorb oxygen effectively. And our bloodstream works in concert with those lungs. We have hemoglobin in our blood, and each piece of hemoglobin can carry 4 units of oxygen, 4 oxygen molecules. And when we talk about oxygen levels, we talk about saturation. We're literally talking about the percentage of each of those hemoglobin packets in our red blood cells that are filled with oxygen. So if somebody's oxygen saturation is 100%, we're saying that each of those hemoglobins is carrying their capacity of 4 oxygen molecules each. If each of those hemoglobins is only carrying 3 out of the 4, somebody's oxygen saturation is 75%, and so on. And what's amazing is that there's a lot of redundancy here, that our tissues, our vital organs don't need us to have a perfect oxygen saturation to be healthy and happy. And so if our saturation is 90% or 88% or 95%, our body doesn't really know the difference. Our organs are getting enough oxygen because they're extracting it from the blood, and there's still plenty of other oxygen molecules attached to the hemoglobin, and it's excess. And so one thing I think that people fail to recognize, and this will kind of parlay into some of the other discussions, is that our oxygen levels often do not correlate to how we feel physically. And this is a huge surprise to many people, because people often feel very winded, they feel very short of breath, and they check their oxygen level, and their oxygen will read 95%. And they say, why is that? Or sometimes people will feel great, they feel fine, and they'll check their oxygen level on their finger, and it'll say 76% or lower. And they say, well, why is that? And I think this is an important thing to recognize, because we're going to talk a little bit about anxiety, and we'll talk about oxygen levels and how that plays into anxiety. And I think we'll talk about shortness of breath, because I think you can't talk about anxiety and interstitial lung disease without talking about dyspnea or shortness of breath. But I think we have to have a fundamental understanding of how these 3 things tie together and their true relationship. And so I'm going to blabble here for a little bit, and then if I say something that doesn't make sense, you can all jump on me for this. But when we think about the respiratory system, and we think about what makes us feel out of breath, what makes us feel normal, our bodies for our entire lives, for decades, and many of you on this call are a little bit older than me. Some of you maybe aren't. I can't see all of your beautiful faces. But for decades, we are all used to breathing a certain way. We expand our chest, we extract our chest, air moves in, air moves out without resistance. And each of those 400 million air sacs are supposed to be nice and compliant, easy to stretch. And our brain, and it's the old brain, primitive brain that we can't control. So it's not the frontal cortex, it's the part of the brain we have no control over, the part of the brain that controls our respiratory rate, our heart rate, our most primitive instincts, is used to what this breathing pattern is supposed to be. And if something is wrong with that respiratory system, it sends a signal that says something is wrong. It's like the check engine light going off in a car. And when that check engine light goes off, we interpret that as shortness of breath or dyspnea. Now, what's interesting is that the different inputs that go to that part of the brain that tell us something's wrong, feel short of breath, or interpret this as shortness of breath, that list of things includes fluid in the lungs, constriction around the chest, like old corsets, right? So women who used to have to wear a corset would feel winded. Clothing being too tight, a bra that's too tight, somebody literally sitting on your chest can do that. Mucus that's plugging up an airway or affecting the way air can flow in or out, right? So fibrosis in the lungs, scarring of each of those 400 million air sacs so that they're less compliant, less stretchable, so that every breath you take is a little bit more work to stretch those balloons, right? Like trying to blow up a stiff balloon at a party as opposed to a balloon that you've stretched. So those things that are more work for your breathing, or that affect the way air flows in and out, or affects the way your respiratory muscles are supposed to breathe, those all send a signal to the brain that say, something's wrong with the system, put on the check engine light. Now, of course, this check engine light is not sophisticated like a 2023 Porsche or Acura or Mercedes. This is the check engine light from the Granada or the Pinto that I grew up driving with my parents, right? It doesn't tell you what's wrong. It just comes on and says, check engine, take it to the shop because maybe it's a carburetor, maybe it's a timing belt, maybe it's something else. And cars don't even have carburetors anymore. My children have no idea what I'm talking about when I mention these things. So it's not a sophisticated check engine light. It just says something is wrong with the system. But what's remarkable is one thing that's not on that list of factors that tells you whether you're short of breath is your oxygen level. Your oxygen level does not determine whether or not the check engine light goes on and to tell you that you're winded. And you may say, well, why the heck would that be, right? That's not very intelligent design or intelligent evolution, depending on your beliefs here, right? Well, actually, it does make sense because this goes back to what I started talking about early on, right? When we talk about the redundancy and the amount of oxygen your blood can carry, right? Every hemoglobin can carry 4 packets of oxygen. And whether your oxygen saturation is 99% or 89% or even 85%, there's still enough there for your vital organs. And it takes a while for your saturation to start going down. So if your body waited for your oxygen level to fall before sensing that something was wrong with your breathing, you'd be in a lot of trouble, right? In that amount of time, your carbon dioxide level could be dangerously high. The boa constrictor that was trying to get you in the woods would have already made a meal of you. The piece of meat stuck in your throat that was trying to cause you to asphyxiate, whether it was woolly mammoth meat or something else, would already be causing you to asphyxiate and potentially die, right? So your body has come up with these other things to sense trouble with the breathing well before your oxygen levels have started to fall. And so oxygen does not play any role, for the most part, in how your breathing feels. It just so happens that most of the major problems that cause patients to feel really out of breath, severe emphysema, severe lung disease with fibrosis, etc., pneumonia, they also happen to cause oxygen levels to fall. And so we tend to make that correlation more often than not, but they actually are not correlated. And so if you have a really bad day and your breathing feels awful, but your oxygen levels haven't changed, you're not going crazy. That's physiology at work. And there are also times where you may feel, your doctor may say, oh, you only need 2 liters of oxygen or 1 liter of oxygen, your saturations are fine. But you say, yeah, but I just feel so much better wearing 3 liters or 4 liters. That's true too. And the reason being is because that increased flow going into the nose, going into the lungs, is telling your lungs, ooh, the flow is better, you're breathing better, relax, turn off the check engine light. And so even though it's not helping your saturations, it makes you feel better. And sometimes that's okay. So sometimes you need a higher flow rate just to feel better. and there's nothing wrong with that. So that's an important distinction. And so I would say when we talk about oxygen and shortness of breath and anxiety or depression and emotions, it's important to have a foundation and first understand how these things all really relate to each other physiologically. And when we have that understanding and we're armed with that knowledge, it's sometimes easier to step back, calm ourselves down and say, okay, I understand this. Now, what can we do about it to put it into perspective? So I just did a lot of rambling there. So I'm going to pause and let you all ask me some questions.
That was a fantastic explanation. And my husband just went through something exactly like that, where his saturation was so high, but he just felt like he couldn't catch his breath.
Well,
Well, I mean, when you did your little finger thing, you would be like, look, it's 92 or something. But he just felt like he couldn't breathe. But so we understand about that design you were talking about. But how does this shortness of breath and what's going on in your lungs and your tissue, how does that get up to your brain to trigger the anxiety? Is that a cellular process, or what is that?
Yeah. So the fact that we feel anxious when we can't breathe is just a natural human response, right? That means you have a functioning amygdala. And, you know, there are few feelings worse. I would argue there's no feeling worse than feeling that you can't catch your breath. There's a reason that waterboarding is considered inhumane. It's considered torture because it simulates drowning. And so when you feel like you can't catch your breath, you feel like you're going to die. Because if you can't breathe, you can only hold your breath for so long. You can't live. And even if your oxygen levels are fine and you are safe, the sensation that you can't breathe is horribly frightening. And your primitive brain doesn't know that, right? Your primitive brain doesn't know that your oxygen levels are fine. It doesn't care because that's not one of the inputs it looks for. And so as far as your primitive brain is concerned, as far as your amygdala is concerned, you're at risk of dying. And so your flight or fight kicks in because you need to get out of that situation right now because it's life or death. What a horribly frightening experience that must be. And when you don't know when that's going to come, when the next mucus plug or episode of shortness of breath, right? And so, yeah, that's anxiety provoking. It should be, because we evolved to have that to protect ourselves, just like we would be frightened if we saw a snake jump in front of us or somebody in a dark corner with a gun or a fire in our home. And it's the same primitive response. And so, yeah, we should feel anxious. It's natural. And so I think, you know, what happens is that for most patients, I think, and I don't have lung disease, but even when I have a stuffy nose and I try to take a shower and wash my face, that alone is enough to make me feel miserable. I cannot imagine what it's like for anybody on this call. I think that the spiral of feeling that you can't catch your breath with most of these conditions, you then naturally try to breathe faster. And this causes a sort of spiral effect with rapid shallow breathing, and patients often get panic attacks. And then you're also anxious about when the next time you may feel that way, right? And so you're just, I think anxiety at baseline is elevated about other things in life potentially because you don't know when you're going to feel that way. You're anxious about going out in public or when you're going to have another coughing fit or, you know, about your disease condition in general? Are you going to have a flare up, right? And so anxiety breeds anxiety. This is just the human condition. Oxygen plays into this as well, because I think when patients see their oxygen level going down, regardless of how they're feeling, they get anxious about their condition, right? Who wouldn't, right? If you're watching your oxygen level fall, you're going to be worried about your breathing, and that will make you feel anxious. We also know how convenient that just being anxious can make us feel short of breath, right? And so if I were to tell somebody on this call, in 5 minutes, you're going to go give a lecture to 1,000 people on a topic you haven't prepared for. Oh, and you're going to do it in your underwear. Well, I imagine that automatically your heart rate will rise. You may feel sick to your stomach. Some of you may vomit. Some of you may get diarrhea, depending on whether you have IBS. And all of you would have an increase in your respiratory rate. Some of you would actually feel very short of breath. And we've had patients admitted for crippling shortness of breath that was actually all related to anxiety. And so this interplay between anxiety or depression or a combination of those two and lung disease can be a positive feedback loop where one feeds into the other. And seeing low oxygen levels just feeds that fire. So, it's a bad combination. It's a challenging combination. It's salt in the wound. It just makes this a lot more difficult to deal with when you're already not feeling well physically. I think it's very difficult to separate emotional health from physical health because one leads directly to the other. And that's not unique to lung disease. I think that's true of all conditions that afflict the human body and the human spirit.
That is so true. I can identify with anxiety. I'm one who brings it on myself. I've read that approximately 60% of people living with PF will suffer from anxiety at some time, if not a lot of the time, which it sounds like they could. In addition to hypoxia, are there some other common occurrences that typically trigger these feelings of anxiety in patients? You mentioned some, just, maybe looking that your oxygen tank is getting low and things like that. But I know sometimes I watch my husband working on a project or doing a painting or something like that, where he is very intent and he's holding his breath. So I know there are other things you can do just, because of who you are. Does anything come to mind on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting statistic, Shelley. I think it's understudied. I mean, it's actually one of our projects here is to better define just the incidence of anxiety or other mental health conditions in patients who have chronic lung disease. That number does not surprise me, and it wouldn't surprise me if it's actually even higher. If you don't ask, you don't know. And I don't think it's something we routinely even get into. And I myself am guilty of this because there's so many other things we deal with in our visits. And I'm not trained as a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Although much of my visits are often dealing with non-medical things. Sometimes we're just talking about life in the office. But I think, that's a good question. And, I'd be curious to poll the audience. I mean, what things make people anxious? And I can tell you just in my experience as a provider and in talking to people as a person, the things I hear that make people anxious. I would say the most common denominator, at least in my practice, and I'm sure it's not unique to mine, is fear of the unknown and just either what is my diagnosis? The fact that this is often a condition where oftentimes we don't know why this happened, what is causing it, and lack of a clear diagnosis, although we try to get as close as we can. And just not knowing what is going to happen to me. What is this going to look like? What is my prognosis? Am I going to have a flare-up? And what is this going to mean for my family? And I think people are constantly living in fear and fear of the unknown. And I think we live in a society and we are creatures who like to be prepared. We like to know what's coming. We like to know, what lies ahead. And this is true of everything. I like to know what I'm having for dinner, right? And that's such a small, stupid thing. But when you're talking about your life and your body and how you're going to feel, am I going to suffer? Is my family going to suffer? Can we afford this? Can we afford a basic medication that is maybe my only hope of slowing this, right? I mean, so, the list of things that can cause anxiety when you don't feel well is endless. So I think those are the things that I think the common thread that's woven through, every silk that comes in. And then sometimes it's just little things, fear of hanging out with grandchildren or children because nobody wants to get sick, right? Whether it's COVID or any virus, RSV, or, you name it. People have been petrified of catching a virus, and yet petrified of not being able to live life, because if you can't see family, what is it all for, right? And that tension. So, I guess on some level, at the end of the day, it almost doesn't matter what causes the anxiety, because they're all valid causes, and all these feelings are valid too. And then we have to try to deal with them.
Oh yes, COVID anxiety was great in this community.
Yeah.
Before, I know you've got limited time, but before you take a couple of questions from the chat or from a patient, are there any long-lasting effects of anxiety untreated that would affect other parts of your body or otherwise your well-being?
Well, this is not well studied with hard science, and I think it's hard to prove. But I'm going to do a little hand waving here, so this is not fully scientific, but I think we all know that stress kills, right? I mean, there's no question stress is bad for you. We know stress has profound effects on the immune system. People who are stressed and fatigued, they get sick more often. They're more prone to infections. I can't prove it, but if I had a nickel for every patient who came to me with a newly diagnosed autoimmune disease or connective tissue disease following a major tragic incident in their life or loss in their life or incredibly stressful event in their life, I could probably retire early. I think so. We know stress is important. I don't think the French or Italians live longer because they drink wine. I think it's because you can't drink wine when you're stressed. I think it's because you're actually just calming down and relaxing, right? I think it's a lifestyle thing. So I do think that, stress, anxiety, I think these things are profoundly bad for us. And I think we've done a brilliant job in America at increasing stress in every possible way here. The fact that you're in an art studio, bravo, because I think we all need to draw more, paint more, meditate more, spend more time with family, and just slow down. This meeting today is probably the best thing I will do all day, right? I mean, so we need to spend more time together. So yes, I think it's hard to prove, but there is no question that people live longer, live better, have better health outcomes when they are less stressed and can find ways to deal with stress, with healthy means.
Absolutely. And just living in France or Italy would not be that bad either. It'd calm me down as well. Okay, I know you've only got about 10 more minutes. So while Kathy Porter is checking the chat for some questions, I know one patient, Jeannie Tom, she had a big experience with hypoxia. Jeannie, if you're available, would you unmute and just tell us what you went through?
Normally, I don't sleep with oxygen. I only wear oxygen when I'm exerting myself. So I went to bed Thursday night, and when I woke up Friday morning, my oxygen, I felt kind of weird, like something was different. So I checked my oxygen, it was 70 over 104. And I knew that I had to get to emergency, but my anxiety really occurred after when the ambulance team came to take me. I was actually fixated on the idea that I needed to fill my oxygen tank before I went out. They wanted to take off, they actually took off my my downfill coat. I said I was cold, and they said that they had to take it off. That I dropped my purse, and I wanted that, but I was strapped in, so I couldn't get my purse. So finally, the EMS group gave me my purse and my keys, and then I felt calm again.
Yes, okay.
But I felt it was a loss of independence, or that I was going to surrender my independence.
Oh my goodness. And Kathy Porter, you've been watching the chat. Do you have some other profound questions or comments like that that's truly scary what Jeannie went through?
I'm going to summarize the questions, Doctor, because I know you're short on time. But Genebordeau asked one that I think a lot of us think about. And when she exercises, she wears a device to monitor her saturation. And usually, she can keep it above 90%. But she says sometimes when it drops down to 85% or the mid 80s, she stops to recover. Her question is she damaging any of her health or other organs when her saturation drops for a short while? Can you talk about that just quickly?
Yeah. And Jeannie, I'm glad you're here and back home, and it sounds like a horribly harrowing experience. And so I'm sorry you had to go through that. When you're in this fight or flight mode, when you're getting anxious, we're not thinking clearly, and then getting to a level of a saturation of 70%, we're maybe not thinking fully clearly. And tying into the next question, having prolonged saturations in the range of 70%, which is in a low and I would say dangerous zone for things like cardiac arrhythmias, heart arrhythmias, or starting to affect your ability to even process big picture versus your own bubble, as Jeannie related to. But then the question at hand about exercising and oxygen falling transiently for a short while into, let's say, the upper 80s or the mid 80s. And so this is where it gets into a little bit of a gray zone. And so, Medicare doesn't even approve oxygen unless your saturations are 88% or lower. And the reason for that is your vital organs really don't know the difference or care too much whether your saturation is 89 or 99%, for the most part, right? When we start getting into the 80s, nobody has, fallen over or died from a saturation of 85%, right? That's still enough oxygen to be okay. But if you were to walk around with a saturation of 85%, over the long term, right, weeks to months, that can put a strain on the heart and put you at risk for developing a condition called pulmonary hypertension, which is an elevated blood pressure that affects just the blood vessels within the lungs themselves, right? So instead of measuring blood pressure on your arm, if we were to measure the blood pressure just in the lungs that the heart pumps against, that pressure can become elevated, and that can be a serious condition. And that condition can occur over time, usually months or longer, if you have a persistent exposure to lower oxygen levels, usually mid 80s or lower. Now, if you're spending most of your time, in the 90s or upper 80s or better, and every once in a while for a minute or two or a few minutes dropping down, and then you come right back up because you rest, that's not really a big issue. And so, for patients who, for the most part, don't need oxygen and they only rarely dip down quickly, using oxygen probably is not of much benefit, because lugging the darn thing around, because of how much it weighs, is probably more effort and exertion than it's worth. Now, what I would say is that there is a benefit to exercising and to staying fit. And slowing yourself down so that you don't dip into the mid 80s is not always the right answer. And so sometimes you're better off putting on oxygen, turning it up to what you need to so that you can exercise appropriately to keep yourself fit. And so, these are individual scenarios and something that you should talk to your doctor about, whether it's, behooves you to wear oxygen so that you don't dip into the mid 80s when you're exercising for 30 minutes or going for that long walk. Because it's very easy to say, well, I'll just slow myself down so that I don't desaturate and I don't need oxygen. But then you're really just letting yourself get deconditioned and out of shape. And when you get out of shape, you get more short of breath with any given activity. And so that you don't get more short of breath, you slow yourself down more and you get into this vicious cycle, right? So, these are individual scenarios, but that's what I'll say about transient drops in oxygen and the rest of the body.
Oh my God, that's a fantastic answer. I know you've got to head out. We hate to lose you so quickly, but so I'm going to put you on the spot. Can we get you back at another time for another meeting?
Sure.
Say yes.
I have time maybe for one more question. How about that?
Oh, okay, that's great. Kathy, what do you have?
It's hard to select. We had such good questions
Yeah.
and several relating to the anxiety, coming to the reality of your condition. This is the one I will ask because I think it touches on several people. Some people ask, why does my heart rate skyrocket whenever they exert themselves? And can you talk just a little bit about the relationship between heart rate and oxygen saturation and hypoxia?
Yeah, absolutely. So the heart and lung are married, right? They are physically tied to each other. It's not always a good marriage, but they can't get divorced, right? And so even normal, healthy hearts and lungs are intrinsically tied, right? And so there is a pulmonary cardiac reflex where even if you force yourself to hyperventilate and you just start breathing fast, your heart rate will go up compensatorily, which makes sense when you think about the whole purpose of our heart. The only reason we have a heart is to love and to pump the blood that our lungs have put oxygen into, right? Now, cardiologists don't like when I say that because they think the heart's important, but really the lungs are the most important organ of the body. We've all established that. And the heart is just there to take that beautiful oxygenated blood that the lungs have worked so hard to condition and then pump it around the body, right? So the heart is just a servant of the lungs. So if your brain, remember, old brain again, right? The old part of the brain that controls heart rate, controls respiratory rate, et cetera. If that old part of the brain senses that your respiratory rate increases for any reason, it says, oh, the lungs are working harder. They must be oxygenating more blood. We got to do something with this great blood. We got to pump it around faster so it doesn't get wasted. So whenever your respiratory rate goes up, your heart rate usually goes up in tandem if things are functioning appropriately. So that's one part of it. That's in normal, healthy hearts and lungs, right? Kids, everybody. Now, the other thing that happens is if you are anxious or not happy with how your breathing feels, anxiety jacks up your heart rate. Most patients with lung disease, any type of lung disease, are out of shape. Sorry to say this, but most of you are out of shape, even if you are thin or go for walks. Walking is not exercise. Walking is great for you. You should keep doing it, but it's not true cardiovascular exercise like getting on a treadmill, training for a marathon, right? It's not the same as cardiovascular fitness. So myself included, most people here are not in true cardiovascular shape like Michael Phelps, right? So when you try to exercise, because you've been slowing yourself down because you don't want to feel winded, because it's a horrible sensation, as we've established, your heart just isn't in good shape. What it means to not be in good shape from a heart perspective is that the heart actually is not as strong and can't pump as much blood every time it squeezes. So if it can't pump as much blood per volume each squeeze, it has to pump faster to make up for that volume, right? And so people who are out of shape, no matter who they are, they have a faster heart rate for any given activity. So we have anxiety, we have a faster respiratory rate, cranking up the heart rate, and we have the fact that people are just not in good shape. So when you put all that together, it's like the perfect storm that most people with any kind of lung condition, whenever they start moving around to do any kind of activity, they have a much higher heart rate than the average person would. Now, another inconvenient truth is that when you have lung disease, especially things like pulmonary fibrosis or interstitial lung disease, the faster your heart rate, the lower your oxygen level goes. I'm going to repeat that. When you have pulmonary fibrosis, the faster your heart rate, the lower your oxygen level gets. Now that does not seem fair, does it? So you mean to tell me I'm out of shape because of my condition, I'm anxious because of my condition, I have to breathe faster because of my condition. Those three things make my heart rate go up. And because my heart rate's going up, because of those three things I really can't control, my oxygen level is going to go even lower than it should be, which is also going to make me feel more anxious. Yeah, I know, not fair. Perfect storm. And the reason your oxygen levels go lower when your heart rate goes up is because when you have scarred lungs or fibrotic lungs or inflammation in the lungs from connective tissue disease, when anything is wrong with those 400 million alveoli and their walls are a little bit thicker, those balloons are a little bit thicker, it takes longer for oxygen to get absorbed across that thicker wall and get into the bloodstream. And so when the oxygen's trying to get absorbed across the wall and jump onto a red blood cell, right? It's like you're trying to you're at an amusement park and there's like a conveyor belt and you're trying to hop onto the conveyor belt to get onto the next ride with your kid. Well, if that's going faster, it's harder to get on. And so when the blood flow is faster through the lungs and the blood is going through the lungs more quickly, oxygen has less time to get into the bloodstream. And so more blood is racing through the lungs without picking up oxygen. And so now you have deoxygenated blood circulating in your body. And that is blood that shows up on your pulse ox as being the unsaturated blood. So your saturations stay low. And so a lot of patients with interstitial lung disease, no matter how much oxygen they wear, if their heart rate goes too high, their saturations won't get out of the 80s if their heart rate is too rapid. So these are some of the challenges that you're all facing. Whether you realize the physiology behind it or not, you're living this every day and probably have experienced this.
I think that's a good endorsement for why we should keep in shape, why we should manage our anxiety if we can, and I think that's probably a good segue. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but I'm going to turn it back over to Shelley.
Dr. Hallowell, thank you so much. This was incredible. We really are so grateful and look forward to when you're going to join us again. I really, really appreciate this so much. And sorry we have to say goodbye, but this has been wonderful for us.
No, I have some ILD patients waiting, ironically, but and I don't like running late, but for clinic, so I'll run over there. But again, I sincerely thank you for welcoming me to your community. I wish you all the best. I know it's not easy, but you are inspiring how you handle this with grace. And I do what I do because of people like you. So thank you. And I wish you all the best.
Bye-bye. That was so wonderful. And we have next on our agenda, we have Jessica Schull, Director of Digital Therapeutics at Vicor, who is the one who recommended Dr. Hallowell to us. And she'll be able to explain the ALMI study Vicor is doing to help relieve anxiety. And Jessica, my husband has a question for you first. So
Sure.
Go ahead, Scott.
Hello, Jessica. How are you doing today?
Good.
Well, as a sort of a segue from Dr. Hollowell's presentation, in my own personal experience recently, I experienced what I thought was an exacerbation, and my saturation levels just dropped. The bottom dropped out, I started requiring almost 2 to 3 times as much oxygen to stay saturated. But moving back a step, what had happened to me is I had a conversation with my pulmonologist about anxiety. And she was telling me that she asked me if I was experiencing anxiety. And I denied that. I said, no, I have no anxiety. And Shelley was sitting beside me and she gave me a good elbow into the ribs. She said, yes, you do have lots of anxiety. And so we had a little discussion about it. And my anxiety presents itself, anxiety and depression presents itself as irritability and anger outbursts. And so I'd been experiencing a lot of that. So my pulmonologist, Dr. Maggetto, here at Baylor in Dallas, suggested that sometimes the medications that I'm taking, particularly the antifibrotic phenidone, actually aggravates anxiety, and which I already have. And so she prescribed Lexapro for me, and I started taking it. It took me about 30, 40 days to ramp up to it to where it was being effective. And actually, it made a significant difference, and I started feeling much better. And then I started presenting some of the irritability and whatnot. And so she upped my dosage from 10 milligrams to 20 milligrams of Lexapro. And after I'd been on it for about 2 weeks, that's when my exacerbation event occurred. I'm relating this in retrospect, but the Dr. Hallowell even mentioned it, and another pulmonologist mentioned it, that sometimes a antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication, if you get too much of it, can actually cause your system to get so slowed down that you don't breathe correctly and you get desaturated. So I stopped taking the 20 milligrams, went back to 10, and I did recover. I thought I was actually facing an end of life situation where my disease was progressing. So that even increased my anxiety. Mm-hmm. So I guess the segue here would be, I know that you've got a lot of expertise in this area. So how would the application that you have help a person like me who's experiencing anxiety? I'm also, seeing a psychologist as well to help with the underlying conditions that cause this anxiety. So what other things could I do for this?
Well, it's a great question, and I think the experience is it's a narrative that it's actually informative for me, because I'm not a physician, and I think Dr. Hallowell is such a brilliant speaker and so passionate, and probably could explain more of the physiology and what's happening. But we do know that the anxiolytics, like there are various ones that are prescribed, they tend to reduce anxiety by, I suppose, reducing reaction to things. And I don't know exactly what's going on in the body, but I've heard from other physicians as well that it can lead to sort of a couch potato state. You sort of sit and you don't care too much about one thing or the other, and you don't need to move anywhere. And so that actually reduces mobility internally as well. And so that includes breathing. And, we don't want that for any patient, especially not for lung patients. And so I think the resource that Alamy provides, this digital product that we're testing, is that it encourages breathing. There are breathing exercises. It encourages you at a very personal level to do the things that matter to you and to support you in trying them in a way that is safe and supportive of the triggers that affect you. And so I would like her to recommend our study if if someone's interested in trying a non-drug approach to treating anxiety, because what we're doing, it's a software. So you mentioned a psychologist, like basically what this product is, and I can show a picture of the website if that's of any help, but here, let me do that. Oh, I can't share. Okay, that's it. No worries. So if you have a therapist talking to you, it's basically like once a week, once every 2 weeks, however often you can do it, the more the better. And you build on your own story. And the Almi product and the study that we're doing is a cognitive behavioral therapy. So the idea, I'll put a link in the website. Sure. I'll put a link here. Sure. Oops. Send to everyone. Okay, I'll just send it to the co-host. There's the link.
Just Scott made you a co-host, so if you need to share your screen, you should be able to share your screen now.
Oh, I can, look at that. So this is one of the views of what it looks like. And this is the brochure that the PF Warriors has. I can maybe show you a website, which is a little more illustrative. Here, if we go to the actual therapy. The intervention that is offered is a cognitive behavioral therapy. So what it does is act like a therapist, but that you interact with this software every day. So you can explain to it what are your triggers, what are the things you like, how you feel, and it helps you analyze why you feel the way you do, and then build coping mechanisms that are specific to the way you live your life. And everyone's going to have a different way of doing it. And so that's why, in a way, it's much better than a drug that everyone is treated the same way. In this online therapy, let's say, it's not with a human, it's with a software. But the software was built by psychologists and ILD specialists and nutritionists and sleep experts and all of these people contributing to the way that it interacts, so that and it won't solve all problems, but it's certainly a way to start learning how to calm down, how to regulate breathing, how to meditate, how to reduce the symptoms of anxiety. And so here, now I can share again the website. Here we go. So this is what it looks like. And it can be on a mobile phone or a tablet. And in the study, the way it works is it's all decentralized. So you don't have to go to any clinics or have any hospital visits. It's basically that you download this software onto your phone or tablet, and then you can use it at home for about 9 weeks. And you get asked questions every 3 weeks, I think, about how you're feeling and what the level of anxiety is. So yeah, we'd love for people to join the study. It's been recruiting, like we've been inviting people to participate for a few weeks now, and we're going to be doing that through until May. So it's not going to be the rest of the year or anything. So just to say, there's a certain timeline that we have to finish in, but
okay. And Jessica, sometimes when I'm joining different things or filling out, if I get stuck on something that can kind of help you, understand the process of registering.
Yeah. So the way it works is we have a company called Curebase. And we aren't allowed to be part of the study, so there's no bias involved, so we can't be involved. But Curebase is the company that gets in touch, and they can help register. They can ensure that everything is, signed and understood, and that the software gets downloaded properly. And the most important thing is that the diagnosis of PF is confirmed, because this is like a study that's going to FDA, and it has a principal investigator, and like Dr. Hallowell mentioned, he's one of the people reviewing, making sure that everyone in the study actually has PF. So what we need is one of those radiology reports, like a PDF that just says, signs of PF, or I don't know what what it says exactly, but it's just a piece of paper that says that. And we can't get it for you, but Curebase, the company that we work with, there's a consent form to let them help get it. It's kind of a process. I know that medical records is a big mess, but we need to have that as part of the study. But otherwise, Yeah, it's from home, and the follow-up visits are all at home or wherever you want to be. You can be on vacation and do it. That's fine too. And this to say, there is a control arm as well. So there will be an arm of, a group of people who do not get the software, but we're giving it to everyone after as well, so that everyone in the end will get to use it and try it, and hopefully we'll see some effect. And so I sent the link. I don't know. And Shelley, go ahead and you can send it to whoever needs it. So I don't know if it will go to everyone if I send it through the chat.
Well, we can actually follow up with this and send an email to everybody that registered for this meeting. We can send that information to them so they can, I'm sure they'll be very motivated to sign up for it because it sounds great. Can't wait for you to get one for caregivers, but one day.
Actually, and yeah, once this is over, the end of this year, we can start working on that.
Okay, all right. But we, Jessica, we really value our relationship with Vicor and you helping patients suffering with anxiety, because it is no fun for any of us who have experienced it. So for all of y'all who will join now, be sure to mention when you join that you learned about this from the PF Warriors. And thank you all for attending today. Be sure to join us for our next educational meeting on April the 8th on another mental health focus dealing with the emotional grief of a life-changing diagnosis with Dr. Andrea Warszkowski, PhD. And following that meeting, our next Warrior to Warrior discussion group meeting will be on April the 28th with Teresa Genovese, who will lead a discussion maybe on traveling, but maybe on hypoxia. So we don't know, but are there any other announcements from anybody?
Thank you for that. And I have to say, this whole group, I echo what Dr. Hollowell says, a really passionate, loving group, and it's been an absolute pleasure. So we're honored to be connected.
And we're very honored to be part of this program. So thank you all again. Thank you, Jessica, for helping with patients with anxiety and for introducing us to Dr. Hallowell. Thank you all for attending. Have a wonderful weekend that's coming up now, and bye-bye for now.